Hello and welcome back to another edition of Innovation Management Bite Size. And just as a reminder, these are a really short fire summary of the lectures. So they're not going to go through every slide that we've spoken about, but they're going to pick out some of the really key ones, some of the really key points, the things that are absolutely essential for you to remember. And they're not as intended as a replacement for the lectures, but rather just something to remind you. So you might find that after the lecture, you find it useful to come back to some of the main points, or maybe when you're writing your coursework. And indeed, when we're thinking about the lecture that we're talking about today and the one we're talking about next week, they relate to part one of the module, which is all about innovation strategy. And this is what your first piece of coursework relates to. So where you're going to be asked to critically evaluate the concept of pioneering. So that's exactly what we're going to be talking about today. And in lecture number two, we're going to be kind of thinking of the reasons for pioneering. Well, that's the reasons why being a first mover in a market is actually a really wise and sensible solution when it comes to think about creating a sustainable competitive advantage. So this is going to form part of the argument of your essay. It's not going to form all of the argument of that, but it's going to be certainly part of that. And last week we spoke about defining innovation generally. We spoke about recombinant innovation, the idea that there's no such thing as a brand new idea, but actually it's about putting two ideas together that were previously unrelated. We defined innovation. We spoke about different forms, different types. We spoke about incremental innovation versus radical innovation. We spoke about different sorts of products and processes. So we had the kind of general introduction last week, and now we're thinking about how do you create a strategy that makes you different from other people. And the argument that we'll make here is that that's a useful thing to think about before you release your product away, or maybe even while you're thinking about what your idea is going to be. What is your intention? How are you going to make this different? How are you going to make it valuable? How are you going to make it new? How are you going to make it meaningful for people? So the narrative of the two lectures we've got here is that any organization has a choice of what we'll call strategic postures. Strategic postures relate to the timing of when your innovation is introduced. Do you do it right at the start? The traditional one is that we would think of innovation as being most successful when it's done by the first movers. So that's when you get the biggest gains. But there's also other strategic postures, whether you're the first follower, that you watch what the first mover does and you learn from their mistakes, or indeed whether you're a late follower, whether you're someone that comes in right to the sort of the back end of a product life cycle and just try to make some incremental changes. So we'll talk about the various advantages of both of these and the disadvantages of both of these. And the main conclusion we'll come to is it does depend. It depends on the market you're in. It depends on how much competition there is. It depends on how much energy and how much resource you need to put into that. So overall, what we hope in the essays is that you will have a kind of contextual argument. It isn't just as easy as to say one is better than another. And fundamentally there we're thinking about how to get that sustainable advantage, and this relates to all sorts of organizations, large organizations who are making changes to their processes, startups who are looking to do something brand new. It's the same process. What we're saying here is you need to be aware of the environment that you operate in. So without further ado, let's get started. Okay, so our first question here is about what actually is strategy. So when we're using this term, what do we mean when we say that you need to have some sort of innovation strategy? And I think it's useful to really define these terms right from the beginning. And when we think about strategy, there's a variety of things that it comes to. And fundamentally, what a strategy is, it's about creating a narrative. It's about if you imagine yourself, there's the picture in the top left here is a cartographer, a person who creates a map. And what you're doing when you're creating a strategy is you're thinking, how do you want to create a map? How do you want to see how you get from A to B? How do you try and interpret the landscape that's around you? So when you're creating an innovation strategy, you need to do more than just thinking, what do I want to do? Or what does this organization want to do? And you need to think about what does this organization want to do in relation to the wider environment that you find yourself in. So this is about diagnosing and then providing some sort of prognosis. So diagnosing the environment that you are in, what are we surrounded by? What are the other organizations? What's the history? What's everything that's come before? What are the successes? What are the failures? What are things that people are doing right now that are working really well? And what are some of the gaps? And in creating this map, that can help us to understand that. When we're also thinking about a strategy, we've got these questions about, well, what do we do? What is it that we actually want to be known for? Something we don't want to do with a strategy is try and do a little bit of everything, because that involves us. It's very resource heavy, but it also means we don't do any one thing particularly well. We don't want to be a jack of all trades and master of none. So we're thinking about, what do we do? What is the particular issue that we are trying to solve? What do we want to be known for? And how can we make gains in that area? It's generally better for an organization to try and really focus on a specific area and really try and solve that, because that gives us a good way of giving a narrative about what our organization does. So it's about creating some meaning. So what do we do? We're then obviously thinking about, well, where are we going? So this is, we would think about what would be referred to as the first level strategy. So first level strategy is, are we focused on trying to understand and differentiate ourselves within the market? So are we not necessarily going to be changing a lot to do with the technology of a product, but actually we're going to change how we brand ourselves. We're going to try and solve certain pain points. So we're not going to innovate in the technology, but we're going to innovate in how we market ourselves. Or are we actually wanting to introduce something newer in terms of technology? So are we looking to create one of these breakthrough innovations, doing something that people haven't necessarily seen before? So where are we actually going? Who are we? So what are we actually aiming to do? What's our identity? What's our purpose? So is our purpose to create shareholder and stakeholder value? Is our purpose to make sure that investors have a good return on their investment? Of course, that has to be important for any organization. But also, are we interested in a more community focus to our innovation? Are we in the industry that we're in to try and, for example, make a difference? Are we interested in sustainability? Are we interested in community building? We want to think about that narrative of, why do we actually exist? Because again, this helps to drive our innovation forward. And especially when it comes to lectures 4 to 7, it helps us to understand why we're doing it. And then finally, how we'll do it. And this is the conversation that we'll be having today and next week, is what is our positioning going to be? How are we going to engage with the competition? Are we going to be first? Are we going to follow after them? Are we going to have a low cost strategy? Are we going to have a differentiation strategy? We think of the competitive landscape a bit like a battleground. So every organization has their own turf. And we have then these turf wars where people are trying to gain and may lose to others. So how are we actually going to engage with our competition? And one of the arguments that we'll make today is that it's really important not only to understand yourself, but to understand that competition and have a good understanding of the environmental landscape around us. And there's various different ways that we can think about creating a strategy. And the traditional one is what we would refer to as the rational perspective or the corporate planning perspective. This is something that's been popular really since about the 1920s. And this was the traditional way of understanding strategy. And importantly, if we understand the historical evolution of strategic management, is that this was a time when the world was a much more stable and linear place. So what we have with this corporate planning, this rational perspective, is a very linear approach to managing, which is that we start off by identifying and predicting what we want to do. So we don't really need to go out into the world, but we can kind of stay in our room and work out, predict what's going to happen. We commit to something, and then afterwards we control it. So it's a very clear linear relationship. We predict it, then we actually do it, and then we manage it afterwards. A, B, C equals success. And this linear approach, this end step, means that there are intended consequences. So we assume that if we predict something, that it will actually happen. So it assumes some sort of omnipotence on our part. Omnipotence meaning that we know everything, or omniscience, where that we can see everything and that we know everything. So managers are seen in this respect to be directors, almost like we have a crystal ball that we can look into and predict what the future is going to look like. So the rational perspective assumes that directors and are managers, and those managers have some sort of omnipotence, which means that they can rationally predict. And it also means, nicely, that we don't have to return to our predictions. If we got it right in the first place, then we just literally need to continue along with that approach. So it's a once and done, and it assumes that there are calm waters. And this might be how you approach things. If you think about a really small scale, how you approach things like essay writing. So oftentimes when we're writing an essay, we look at the question, we predict about what we're going to write. We might make a plan for that, and then we simply just execute that plan. And what is produced at the end should be a reflection on what we predicted. That's often how we think about managing change. However, in reality, as you know, when you're writing an essay, it doesn't always work like that. So we have what we would call our intended strategy, but there are often unintended consequences that occur. So the unintended consequences might be, when you're writing an essay, it might be that you come across a paper that completely shifts how you're thinking about things, or it might be that you have a conversation with a peer, or you have a conversation with the TA or the module leader, and that changes how you think. You realize maybe you've misinterpreted the question in the first place. So that means that your intended strategy will slightly change. So your essay structure, now you'll go back and you'll amend that. So oftentimes when it comes to a strategy, what we need to do is we need to be open and we need to be flexible, so that, yes, we can predict a certain amount in advance, but we need to be open to changing that as things goes along and as new information comes into us. And unintended consequences, great examples are the evolution of AI, and also if we think back to a few years ago of COVID. COVID is absolutely something that many organizations did not predict, and the linear strategy that they had planned from 2019 to 2022. The linear strategy they planned, suddenly that wasn't going to be able to work anymore. You had no customers coming in, so that organizations had to shift and they had to amend their strategy and thinking about what they're doing and where they're going. So this strategic planning perspective, which became much more popular around the 1970s, this is when theorists said, right, any organization has an intended strategy, but quite a lot of that intended strategy is going to be unrealized. So quite a lot of what we predict actually isn't going to end up happening. We need to accept that. Quite a lot of what you prepare for your essay, you don't end up using. That's all fine. Then we move towards what is our deliberative strategy. And as you see all of those little arrows coming in, there's an emergent strategy. So this means this is all of the elements. As we're getting new information, our strategy slightly shifts. A new competitor comes in, they do exactly what we said we were going to do. So we adapt ourselves. So there's a real value here in flexible and adaptive management, and understanding that the management of change is going to be really significant to us. And this kind of strategy is something that we would really be anticipating for organizations, because of the VUCA environment that we exist in, the volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous environment that we find ourselves in. Because of all of those terms, we're going to end up in a situation where there are unintended elements, so we need to be more adaptive. So that's important when it comes to strategy. So that's our first part, where we're looking at what strategy is. And now let's think a little bit about these strategic postures. And as I said, in lecture 2 today, we'll be talking about one of those strategic postures, being a first mover. And in lecture 3, we'll be thinking about some more of the critiques of that, why there maybe being a first mover is too risky, and how we could adopt different strategies of following instead. But for now, let's stick with the idea that to be a good innovator, a good innovative organization, we need to be first. We need to beat other organizations, and we need to get to the market first. So the first mover, we'd often use the term first moving and pioneering relatively interchangeably. Pioneering, you're the first one to discover an area. First mover is your first one to bring an area into being. So your first movers are often the inventors of an idea. They're the first ones that have either created something brand new, or if we go to what we spoke about last week, they're the ones that have first combined two ideas together. And the example that we used this week was around Nintendo and the Wii. So Nintendo didn't invent motion controls, but they are the first one that successfully invented and then innovated. They brought it to market, the idea of combining motion controls and a video games console, and they wrapped it up in the terms of it being a family-based console. So they are people that actually invented a concept, combined this concept together, and brought it to the market. It's often to do, when we're thinking about first movers, it's to do with radical innovation. So it's not just incrementally changing something. So if we look at the PlayStation or if we look at the Xbox, if you look at the competition between those, what they tend to be doing is making incremental changes. So they are still directly in competition with each other, but one will come out with a higher graphics processing, or one will come out with slightly better, more popular games, or one will come out with a slight, whatever it is. Small changes that can just get you a little bit of a market back. However, a first mover, it's often think about maybe creating a new market. So instead of you being locked into this competition over here, kind of just trying to get up the ladder slightly, instead, the first mover is someone that says, I'm not going to engage with that. I'm actually going to start off and do something different over here. Much higher risk, of course, because there's safety that comes in operating in this area, because we know what the rules are. Much higher risk to set up on your own, but a much higher reward, of course. So what our first movers will often do is be the first one to bring an idea to market, and then they really focus on defending their position, because once they've created their new market, other organizations who are operating on this ladder, they might say, well, I quite like the look of this new market. I'm going to come over and steal some of those ideas. So first movers are first interested in radically innovating a new concept, and later they're interested in defending their ideas. And this is something that first movers really do have to do. There's advantages that come along with being a first mover, but they have to defend their concepts. And some of the advantages that first movers get are listed out here. So this is a really, really good paper that I would highly recommend that you read. It's by Montgomery and Lieberman and Montgomery. And what they talk about is the advantages of being a first mover. I would say this is absolutely essential reading for your first piece of coursework. It's a really nice piece. It's a bit old now, but it's a really nice piece, and many of the ideas still stand. And they say that if you are this first mover in a market, if you're the person that wants to radically innovate and radically break through and upset the existing market, there are some advantages that come with you being first. The first one is that you have this form of technological leadership. You have probably created something relatively unique, and you have probably created a unique process in order to actually create that thing. So that technological leadership, if you're there first, it means that you can protect that. You can patent those ideas. You can get your intellectual property rights. You also have probably mastered some of the know-how on how to actually produce that thing. You've had time where you haven't been interrupted by competition to actually create a process for how to bring your idea into being. So you have this technological leadership. Some people refer to this, I really dislike this term, but they refer to this as having a secret sauce. But let's think of it more as Kentucky Fried Chicken, and they have their particular recipe that they have created. When you're first into a market, you get to have your recipe that you have created, and others don't get to come and steal that. So you have a form of technological leadership if you get there first. What you're also able to do is preempt scarce assets. So this means that, let's think of a metaphor here. If you are trying to compete directly with another organization. You can think of that as going into a really busy market hall, right? There's lots of other organizations that are working within that market hall, and you try and get a little space to set up your stall and to sell your goods. Okay, that's one way of competing. However, if you are a first mover, what it means is that before other people can take the assets, you're actually able to start hoarding them. You're able to start taking it for yourself. So in the context of an organization, that might mean that you are able to hire the best people in that field. So you're able to hoard those scarce assets. It might mean that you create relationships and you create supply chains with the biggest organizations who can help you to get those components, for example. So you get to have those relationships. So when people come to your market hall later that you've set up on your own, you've already created relationships. So it's harder for someone new to break into it because you've already got the best things. So you can kind of restrict the access to assets if you get there first. And finally, if you're a first mover, it also means that it's a higher switching cost for buyers. So if you are a first mover, it means that people might be more likely to be loyal to your brand. So it might mean that buyers, that people within the market, users, have become most used to your product, and the idea of switching to somebody else, it takes more effort on their part. So that introduces a higher buyer switching cost because those people are familiar with you, they've made an investment with you, you have given them the prototypical experience because they've come to your stall first and they've become used to how you talk to them and what you sell to them. So anybody else that comes to that market later is being compared to you. This is risky for someone that's coming into a market later because you're always being compared. Whereas for the first mover, there's no comparison. So you can even be slightly lower quality in the earlier stages because people haven't got anyone to compare you to. Users often have a status quo bias. We often stick with the things that we are most familiar with and the things that we used first. Organizations that move first also have scale effects and experience effects. So simply that you have greater know-how and knowledge of the market and of the users and of the process, and you've had more experience in trying to innovate something new and doing something new, which means that others are coming to this and they're slightly behind where you are. So lots of advantages that Lieberman and Montgomery talk about in terms of being a first mover. And what this means is that your product, your offering, the value that you're offering is then significantly more valuable, and it's more difficult to it's more difficult to imitate. It's rarer and it's organized well. So this is our VRIO framework. So our first mover has the advantage of actually being able to create these barriers. And a good example of this is a particular strategy that we'll be talking about in this lecture called blue ocean strategy. So this is a particular strategy that organizations might take. And with blue ocean strategy, just like I was explaining that market hall concept to you just now, the traditional way of understanding how to compete with other organizations is to see the competitive landscape as this red ocean. There are lots of people that operate within one ocean, and we can imagine them like little fish, and they're all taking chunks out of each other. They're eating each other, so there's lots of blood in that water. So when we come to an established market, there are already lots of people in there. It's already really aggressive in terms of the competition. So there's already an established market. We are inherently going to be following other people. We know that the demand is already there for that particular product, which is a good thing. And in terms of our strategy, we need to make sure that we're either differentiating ourselves or we're coming in at a lower cost. That's the way to kind of compete and to get other people onto our side. The disadvantage of operating in this red ocean is that there's such high competition, and advantage is very, very temporary. We're naturally going to be following what other people have done. We are going to be making incremental changes to what other people have done, and any advantage that we have is temporary. So if you look at the PlayStation and the Xbox, any advantage that either one gets, they're not really established as the market leader. They only have this temporary lead over another. So it's much more precarious. Now, some people say that organizations like to go into these red oceans because they at least know that a demand exists. So it does have this becoming nature to it. But of course, it's a dangerous place to be. Blue ocean strategy, on the other hand, and we go into much more detail about this in the lecture, blue ocean strategy is where we say we want to make the competition irrelevant. We don't want to go into a red ocean where there's lots of other organizations that already exist. What we want to do is jump over into a blue ocean that doesn't have all of this blood. It doesn't have this aggressive competition going on, but actually we're going to go into a place and we're going to be the only person there. So we are actually then redefining and reframing markets. So we are now creating a new market, which means the competition is irrelevant. This is inherently about being a first mover and being a pioneer. We are spotting a gap where people haven't been served before, and we are saying, I'm going to fill that gap, and I'm going to set myself up separately to what other organizations have done. Again, the Nintendo Wii is a very good example of this. They were actually attracting non-customers, people who wouldn't have ever bought a console otherwise. It's people that were interested in new technology, but particularly children and families who weren't necessarily going to be buying the new Xbox or PlayStation 3 as it was released. But actually, this was creating a brand new market. And the advantages of this are very clear. It means that you are the only one selling to these people. So you are someone that's much more likely to have, if you find an effective blue ocean, much more likely to have a sustained competitive advantage because you are the first one there. So this is all about creating a brand new marketplace. And there's lots of different examples of the blue ocean strategy that we've spoken about, whether that be Yellowtail, whether that be Nintendo Wii, whether that be particular flight companies. And the other thing that it's worth noting about blue ocean strategy is that it's not about either having a low cost strategy or a differentiation strategy. It's actually value innovation is all about having low cost and differentiation. So this goes against the traditional way of understanding competition. And it's saying that because we're creating a new market, it does inherently have to be low cost, but we want to create a new market, so it has to be differentiated. So we really need to think about how can we reduce our costs to become a new person creating a new market, but also how can we make ourselves sufficiently different so that we position ourselves away from that red ocean. And there are kind of scientific ways that you can go about working out what the market would look like, and we looked at this in terms of the Nintendo Wii and how they competed with the PlayStation 3 and the Xbox. So what they did is that they created what we call the strategy canvas, which is what you're looking at on the left-hand side of the screen now. And we literally go through all of our competitors and we say, right, what do they do? And what do they do really well? And we can condense that down into a graph and say, what are the things that people already compete with? Because this helps us to understand what our gap is going to be, right? It's not just about predicting what a gap might be or thinking you've seen one. You have to have a really clear understanding of what the competition are doing. So what Nintendo did is that they worked out precisely what their competitors were doing to work out what they want to compete with and also what they don't want to compete with. So with Blue Ocean strategy, we then have this ERRC grid. So in order to lower our costs, we engage in certain forms of subtractive behavior. So there are certain things that we're actually going to completely eliminate so that we don't have to spend our money and our resource trying to work out what to do. So in the case of Nintendo, what they said is, okay, Xbox and PlayStation, they have DVD players and they have connectivity. However, for our product, we know that putting the resource into creating a DVD player and creating this kind of really intricate form of online play, that's going to be quite costly for us. So we're going to lower our costs and not try to compete in that area because those organizations are already doing that really well. It's going to be harder for us to market ourselves in relation to that. It's going to make us look like direct competitors. So instead, let's actually eliminate that. Let's not add that into our marketing strategy. So part of Blue Ocean strategy is saying, what do we totally cut out? There are then some other areas where we say, well, these are things that we can't completely reduce, can't completely eliminate, but what can we reduce what we spend our money on? And in the case of Nintendo, it was these areas. So computing power, storage, and HD video. These are things that couldn't be eliminated. You can't eliminate processing power. You can't eliminate storage. But they were saying, again, Xbox and PlayStation have had loads of experience in creating a really, really strong environment with this. So what we're going to do is we're not going to try and compete in those particular areas, but instead they're going to exist, but we're just going to lower that right down. So the Nintendo Wii has not got strong processing power. It doesn't have a lot of storage, but in doing that, in not spending our money on storage and hard disk space and HD video, that means that again it lowers our cost. So the Wii was produced using pretty old technology. Actually, they refer to it as withered technology. And this is often things that could be purchased at kind of standard Radio Shack stores. So they weren't using high-end technology at all. They were using real low-end technology, but they were using it in a really innovative way. So these are things that meant that they could actually lower their costs. So they weren't coming into this brand new market with a really high costing product. So that's our subtractive behavior. That's how we can reduce our costs. And then with Blue Ocean strategy, we also think about how are we creating a sense of value for others so that this new market are going to be attracted to us. So where do we add some revenue? What Nintendo decided is that actually what they can do, they noticed that the price of Xboxes and PlayStations were going up and up and up and up and up. So what they said is, well, let's make sure that these new customers, they are actually going to get something valuable, and it's going to have economic value because it's going to be cheap. So they raised value by creating a cheap product, and they could create a cheap product because they eliminated and reduced the right amount. And then finally, and this is really, really key for Blue Ocean strategy, the most key element is what do we want to create? What do we want to do that is absolutely brand new? And this is what requires us to do a very clear market analysis and competitor analysis and say, what do the Xbox and PlayStation, what do they not do at all? What customers are they not attracting at all? Who is underserved? Who are the people that are not buying consoles? Let's look at them and try and create a product that actually speaks to them. So with the Nintendo Wii, they decided that it was going to be family orientated. They decided that we can use these motion controls, and the way they could market that and the way they could sell themselves was saying, we're not trying to compete with Xbox and PlayStation, but instead what we're trying to do is to create this brand new market. So their strategy canvas ended up looking like this. So we can see all the things they reduced, all the things they eliminated, and where they tried to compete. And this was an incredibly successful move for Nintendo. And as we spoke about in the lecture, Nintendo were suffering from a increasing market erosion where they were getting less and less popular. And suddenly the Wii comes out and it becomes one of the greatest selling consoles of all time. So in being really strategic and understanding the nature of the competition, it meant that they could see what markets were underserved and where they could add some value. So quite a scientific approach. Finally, with this, we look at the need for dynamism. So it isn't enough to just be a first mover. It isn't enough just to be a pioneer, because for all organizations that are a pioneer, it doesn't take long before other organizations will start to try and take a piece of your blue ocean. It might not take long before your blue ocean for other fish to hop in there and for it start to become a little bit red. Because when we come to the technology S curve, No first mover has a permanent advantage. They might have a more sustainable advantage, but no first mover has a permanent advantage simply because of the nature of technology. Technology has a ceiling to it. So every technology that comes out, no matter how new it seems at the time, eventually is going to become a kind of basic expectation. So if we think of something like motion controls when they first come out are revolutionary. They are things that people have never seen before. So therefore, people are likely to go out and buy it because they say, we've never experienced this. After a few years, people know what that is. So it's not something that's brand new. It's not something that's brand new and exciting. And this is a really good example of how that S curve works. So we have the early stages of new technology coming in where people are getting used to it. We then have this really sharp increase. So when the Wii is introduced, we have a sharp increase. People become super fascinated about this new technology. It then reaches a level of maturity where people start becoming used to it. And then it starts to dip off. And normally when the form of technology is dipping off, something else comes and something else overtakes that, and something makes people more and more excited. The reason we raise this is to say that organizations can't settle. They can't settle and say, we've come up with an innovative idea and that's going to be an innovative idea forever. It simply won't. And especially in modern society, in our VUCA environment, the S curve for new forms of technology is getting faster and faster and faster. User expectations are becoming such that almost as soon as something new is introduced, people are looking for the newer thing. So when organizations are innovating, there's a lot of cost that comes along with that. And what we have to work out is it worth us putting all that investment into a new form of technology and into a new market if people are going to become used to that and if they can become basic expectations sooner and sooner. So all organizations are going to experience that. And this happened with the Wii. So we look at the great sales of the Wii, and if you look at that little red bar about how successful it was for Nintendo, when they released the Wii U, it operated on similar forms of technology. It was kind of as innovative as the Wii was, but people were used to it by then. So people weren't excited about this new form of technology. So this blue ocean only was temporary. So we don't want to think that any blue oceans or any first movers have a permanent advantage. And that is why it is important for organizations not to just rely on static efficiencies. Static efficiencies means you come up with one idea and then you just kind of coast with that and you say, we've got our innovation and that's it. We're fine. Our organization's always going to exist. What we actually need to have is dynamic capabilities. And this is something that Nintendo are really good at doing, and lots of other organizations are as well, is saying, we recognize that we're going to be creating these new forms of technology, but as a first mover, we can't just rely on the fact that we're going to always exist on that one innovation that we brought in, because there's going to be new competition and people are going to get bored of it. So dynamic capabilities means that organizations should be continually innovating and almost continually trying to find ways of breaking into new markets or finding non-customers. That is the key skill of the blue ocean strategist, is to not stop, but to continually find new ground, to continually be innovating. That is what leads to our dynamic capabilities. So we understand that the environment around us is rapidly changing. Therefore, we need to have a strategy that is always about making new ground. And there are lots of examples of pop stars who do this. So Lady Gaga, Beyonce, Taylor Swift, David Bowie. These are all really good examples of pop stars that have dynamic capabilities, because every album that they release has got like a different theme. It's got something new about it that is attracting more people in. So instead of Taylor Swift releasing the same album essentially every time, people just get bored of that. Whereas what she does is kind of reinvents herself each time. David Bowie was the prototype for this. Reinvents every time, so it's got a new narrative. So not only are the old people still interested in that, and the old people are loyal to that, but new people come in each time. So these pop stars all provide examples of people who have got these dynamic capabilities, as opposed to other bands and artists that might do one thing very well, but they just kind of do the same thing over and over and over again, which means that people become a bit bored by them. So Dynamic capabilities combat boredom. And these dynamic capabilities involve sensing the environment. So one thing that it's really important for first movers to do is to constantly be aware of the environment that they are in. So when you're writing your essay, think about the complexity of being a first mover is not just to be innovative, but it's also to understand the environment, doing this really clear market analysis. From there, we can then start to seize new concepts and seize new ideas and develop partnerships with others so that we're developing new products. So sensing the environment, seizing those opportunities, that means we can then transform what we do. We can reconfigure what we're actually offering in relation to the external marketplace. And our managerial system must be set up in a way that is encouraging of innovation. Our managerial system must be set up in a way that is actually encouraging us to say, let's not stop there. Let's try and find something brand new. Let's try and find something different, or try and recombine ideas in new ways. So the reason that we add this at the end is that it adds a kind of a bit of a question mark next to the first moving, because it's saying, yeah, first moving has real advantages to it, and first moving has real benefits to it. However, even from now, we can see that first moving carries a risk, because not only is it very expensive to be a first mover because you have to create this new market and educate users, but it also means that our blue ocean can quickly become red. So when we are a first mover, what we have to be doing is always looking to the next thing. How can we keep on innovating? And really the advantage, the sustainable competitive advantage, comes from the way that the organization is organized rather than just one product that they've created. We can't rely on the success of one product to maintain our organization over time. So first moving is going to be inherently temporary. All right, that is it for today. It is great to see you, and that is part 2, and that will be relating directly to the first assessment that you will be doing. Lovely to see you. Have a great week.